Oh yay, oh yay, oh yay. I call the Space Court Foundation video series to order. Welcome, my name is Chris Hersey, and I am the co-founder and chair of the board of directors for the Space Court Foundation. Thank you for joining us today to continue our video series with our panel titled Tear Down the Wall, Breaking the Silos That Divide the Global Space Community. The Space Court Foundation is a 501c3 educational nonprofit corporation that promotes and supports space law and policy education and the rule of law. The Space Court Foundation produces educational materials and scholarship through the administration of two major projects, Stellar Decisis and the Space Court Law Library. The foundation engages in partnerships and collaborations that grow greater awareness of space law and how disputes in space may be resolved as humans venture further from the Earth in the not too distant future. For more information about our mission, programming, and internship program, we ask that you visit our website at spacecourtfoundation.org. Today, I have a special announcement, and we're pleased and excited to announce that the Open Lunar Foundation will sponsor our video series for all of 2021. We thank the Open Lunar Foundation for the generous grant that will enable us to extend our programming to you. For more information about the Open Lunar Foundation, please visit their website at openlunar.org. We appreciate the strong support of the space community and invite you to follow us on social media for the latest information. You can find archived versions of all our programs on our YouTube channel. Just search for the Space Court Foundation. If you enjoy our programming today, please remember to like the video and subscribe to our channel. Your continued support helps us to keep providing you contemporary and innovative programming. Please consider supporting us through Patreon and our merchandise store, Celestial Objections Apparel. All proceeds to the foundation cover the costs of our programming and support our intern projects. Our moderator today is Teresa Hitchens. Very excited to have her here today. Teresa is the Space and Air Force reporter at the publication Breaking Defense. Teresa has previously served as a defense news editor and a senior research associate at the University of Maryland's Center for International and Security Studies at Maryland in the School of Public Policy. Before that, she spent 6 years in Geneva, Switzerland as director of UNIDIR. Thank you, Teresa, for moderating this excellent program. I turn it over to you.
Thank you, Chris. And I want to say thanks to everyone out there tuning in today, and to the Space Court Foundation, both for their excellent programming and for inviting me to moderate today's seminar, Tear Down This Wall, a discussion of how the barriers to cooperation in space governance can be scaled. As humans have become more reliant on satellite services, risks to safe and secure space operations continue to grow, raising a spectrum of potential problems. These range from undermining the long-term sustainability of human space activities for exploration and science to escalation of conflicts up to nuclear war. As such, world leaders, industry experts, academics, and even celebrities have all been adding their voices to the discussions on space safety and security. However, many of the different space communities do not often speak beyond their own niches, their own circles. And this is in large part because the fora for both discussion and action are divided along specialty lines. And this makes governance, especially at the international level, extremely difficult. Indeed, even at the UN, safety and security issues are clearly demarcated with unique competencies assigned to specific bodies. For example, when I first took up the post of the director of the United Nations Institute for Disarmament Research, UNIDIR, in Geneva, I found that the Conference on Disarmament, also based in Geneva, and which has space security on its agenda, in fact, has had space security on its agenda for decades, and the Committee on the Peaceful Use of Outer Space, COPUOS, in Vienna, rarely interacted. Indeed, during my tenure at UNIDIR, UNIDIR was the first Geneva-based security organization to invite the president of COPUOS to come to speak before the Conference on Disarmament. And yet, as the world has seen over the last few years, space activities and the challenges that they bring cut across most boundaries, solving the myriad issues surrounding safe, secure, and equitable use of space amongst nations will require cooperation and coordination among all the different space communities and outside to other communities of users. And remember that all of us are users of space. So today, we are lucky to have a really stellar panel to discuss the impact of these silos, or what the military likes to call stovepipes, within the space community, how they might be overcome to create a responsive, equitable governance framework for space for all. We are incredibly lucky to have with us here today Andre Ripple of the Brazilian mission to the UN organizations in Vienna and a former chair of COPUS, Daniel Porras, my former colleague and non-resident fellow at UNIDIR, Marie Eldholm, who's the director of the Norwegian Industrial Forum for Space Activities, Peter Martinez, who is the director of Secure World Foundation and a former member of the South African delegation to COPUS. This is understating his role. He'll talk about his chairmanship on the um, long-term sustainability guidelines work at COPUS a little later. And Rajeswari Pillai Rajagopal, head of the Nuclear and Space Policy Initiative at India's Observer Research Foundation. I'm not going to go into their full biographies because they are on the website, so take a look. All of them have long history and expertise in space issues, particularly space governance issues. So what we're going to do is I'm going to throw out some questions. We're going to talk for about 30 minutes amongst ourselves, really informally. And then we're going to open this up to questions from the audience. Please put your questions in the chat room, I think, and we will go from there. So, and I'll pick them up and we'll ask them as they come in. Okay. So, audience, don't be shy. Please throw your questions out there so we can have a lively discussion. I am going to start with Andre just because he's over here in my corner, my Zoom corner.
Let me move very quickly to the other side.
Then. Get out of the way. It's after me first. What can I say? There was no rhyme or reason.
Yeah. Okay.
So anyway, you work at COPUS, which focuses on the peaceful uses of outer space, and you've been around the block on these issues. How do you see, or what obstacles do you see that prevent you from addressing the challenges that COPUS faces? You might want to just note that COPUS does also have a limited, for example, mandate. Yeah? So let's kick it off with you.
Okay. Thank you very much, Teresa. It's really a pleasure to be here, and as you said, it is a stellar group. Maybe I'm a comet, but the rest are all stars here. So it's really good to be here and have this opportunity to work, with the audience. I hope we got a lot of questions. I think that's what will make this debate much more interesting. Well, one thing that attracted my attention when Daniel approached me about this discussion was that we talk about silos. And what the first time as a foreigner, I don't know if a native speaker will look at it the same way, but as a non-native speaker, when you think of silos, you think of missiles, And it's interesting that we talk about breaking silos because I think there is an analogy to be had here. And then when we think about COPUS, the Committee on the Peaceful Uses of Outer Space, and I started working on those discussions, particularly on LTS and sustainability. And there was a guideline which was not approved in the first process, but hopefully, we'll make some progress now when we start work again, which had to do with disarmament, not per se, but it called upon countries to refrain from taking actions, that would be construed or perceived as aggressive and so on. And when we were having those discussions, it became very clear from the opinions and messages you got from different countries that there was a lot of concern, and actually a back of there was a lot of backtracking. Because I remember that, for example, some countries initially had a very positive response to that because they thought, well, maybe this is a way forward to advance a discussion on preserving space for peaceful uses and preventing conflict. And then they would get instructions from the capital, say, well, we can't agree to that because we discussed that in Geneva. And my obvious reaction was, oh, I can understand that. I can understand the concerns that each country will have. That's perfectly acceptable, perfectly normal. But how can we talk about sustainability? How can we talk about peaceful uses if we don't address the actual risk of a conflict in space, right? Which can arise out of, let's say, deliberate action, but considering the complexity of outer space activities, it can also, result from a misperception. And we honestly, I don't know if everyone is aware of that. I mean, we are, because we discuss that within our community. But the situation in space and the kind of information we get about intention, about the kind of activities that are happening there is feeble. It is not. I mean, it's very difficult to judge and to assess and determine what kind of intentions are behind an event in space, an incident. And then you think about the environment on Earth. We rely a lot on having a positive environment that would be conducive to some sort of dialogue that would address this kind of conflicts, or not conflicts, but incidents, to be able to solve the situation. And honestly, this is leaving a lot to chance. So one of the arguments that we've been advancing, and I'm not talking about myself, I'm talking about a lot of good people at Copus, is that, well, we have to talk about it. We need to, well, at least start bringing some of the discussions, some information rather, about the discussions that are taking place in Geneva and other fora that deal with disarmament to Copus, so that delegates and the international community that comes together here in Vienna to discuss peaceful uses, the peaceful use of outer space, can be aware of what those issues are, and vice versa. Some people from Copus, have to go to Geneva and other sites to tell them what our concerns are. I think that would be a starting point. But again, back to your question, this has to be done very carefully because there is a lot of suspicion. Okay, I'll come back to that maybe later on, because I would like to give other panelists also their a chance to express their views. But this would be, I would say, my first comments to get us started.
Since we've started on the Copus issue, I'm going to bounce around, and I'm going to go down here to the other end, to Peter Martinez. Since you were so heavily involved in the creation of the guidelines that were agreed and those that were not agreed in the many years of discussion at Copus, I thought maybe you could give us the couple-minute overview of those discussions, what came out, and what the barriers were to making them go. I will also note that perhaps one of the barriers that you can see already is that not everyone understands that those guidelines were even passed and that they are applicable to the nations who agreed to them. For example, not to denigrate anyone, but just the other day, General J. Raymond, the head of the U.S. Space Force, said in a forum that there are no norms in space and that it is a Wild West. And this is not actually true. There are norms. There are also laws, the Geneva Conventions, for example. And yet there seems to be a persistent belief out there in the world, especially amongst militaries, that these don't exist. So perhaps, Peter, you could address some of those issues from the work that you did. We can't hear you.
Sorry, just unmute myself. Thanks, Teresa, and great to be on this panel today. So it was very interesting, the socialization that we had to work through, even to get long-term sustainability of space activities on the agenda of Copus. At the outset of the process, when the concerns around sustainability of the space environment were first floated, by a number of delegations. It was frankly met with some skepticism on the part of other delegations, based partly on misconceptions and partly on misperceptions of the intent behind these suggested discussions. Misconceptions from the sense that a number of countries in the early days of the process could appreciate that there was an issue with space debris in outer space, but they thought that it wasn't their problem. They thought this was the problem of the advanced space nations who had created this mess up in orbit, and it was their problem to deal with. And it took them some time to realize that this posed a threat to the continuity of data and services that they themselves were reliant on. So space sustainability was very much their issue as well. But it took some time to socialize this concept in corpus. That was the misunderstanding. The misperception was that a few countries were suspicious about the timing of this. Remember, this was in the late 2000s, which was when new space was just beginning to take off. The technological and financial barriers to becoming a space actor were dramatically dropping. There were new possibilities for access to space. And so a number of countries, quite understandably, saw this as an attempt by the established space powers to keep the Space Club exclusive by raising the barriers to entry on the pretext of environmental considerations for space. And so both of these issues needed some time to be worked through, but eventually the committee started dealing with it. And it was quite interesting. In the early days of the discussions, there would be maybe a dozen space experts in the room. And towards the end of the meeting, we kept on having to ask the Secretariat for larger and larger rooms because there would be, 70, 80, 90 people in the discussions. And at one point, it actually started to get embarrassing. I'm sure Andre will remember well. There were more people sitting in informal consultations for LTS than in the plenary session as we neared the end of the process. So it shows an evolution in participation, in engagement, and so on. But during that process, I learned quite a number of lessons, both in the early days as a participant in a national delegation and subsequently as chairman of the process, on a number of, if you like, systemic barriers to participation in corpus that I would like to talk about. And I don't know if now is the right time or whether you'd like to move on to other aspects of the agenda. You're muted, Teresa.
Once again, the mute button defeats us all. I'm gonna happens all the time on Zoom. So what I'm gonna do, Peter, is we're gonna save that thought because I want to bounce to Raji on the question of the barriers that exist between countries who have been long-time space actors and countries who are just becoming space actors. And why those silos or divisions exist and whether or not they are starting to crumble or what we need to do to make sure that they crumble, because this gets back to the point I raised about equitable, which you don't often hear in national discussions. And I think it creates an important barrier, or at least a perception of a barrier that we need to overcome. So Raji, why don't you take a couple minutes to address that?
Thank you, Teresa. So yeah, in line with both what Andrew said and Peter, I think much of the policy conversation today lacked that right balance in terms of balance and framework in bringing together the different compartments and silos that we have created. Essentially, you're talking about a number of different stakeholders, be it economic, scientific, technical, security. They don't even get to talk to each other on a fairly periodic basis in maximizing the benefits of using space technology while addressing some of the challenges in outer space. Be it space debris, space safety, security, and sustainability, radio frequency interference. And these issues are very, very closely interlinked in a sense. So having these divisions and demarcations, first and foremost, they are not helpful.
Hey, Raji, real quick. Sorry, Raji, pull your microphone away from your scarf.
Oh, okay. Sorry. Okay. Hopefully that's better. Okay. Second is, of course, the north-south divide or the east-west divide and so on and so forth. That's another set of problem that you have had in a sense. Because, but at the same time, it's not going to be a simple and straightforward issue, because even within the South, when you're looking at it, there are sharp divisions, there are tensions, conflicts, because you have some of the rising powers. If you look at even the last 2 decades, you have some of the rising powers with baggage of history, unresolved territorial issues. If you take the case of India and China, China and Japan, and so on and so forth. So there are serious, and of course, a range of middle space powers who are just emerging, who have just begun to appreciate the utility of space in changing the lives of the people. So they are going to become more active in space, whether mostly for social and economic purposes, but they, some of them, at least in Asia, they're also developing the space program from a national security perspective. So you are going to have a number of different countries come together, and Asia has a sizable number, a good number of established space players, or and then you have the emerging space players. So I think the first and foremost is, how do you create an inclusive platform that is going to move away from the thematic divisions between Geneva and Vienna, breaking the geographical divides. These are essential if we have to be able to engage in meaningful dialogues, which to me is the first step into framing a long-term sustainable solutions. And I think emphasis on inclusiveness and diversity, these are essentially important. Breaking those diversities and some of the breaking some of the divisions and barriers that have been created would automatically mean that you're dealing with a large number of parties, stakeholders, which could be somewhat inefficient if you ask some of the people, some of the folks who have been working on some of the issues. But I think this requires a bit of work, bit of give and take, maybe even some compromises in identifying the priorities, challenges, but I believe that it would create a large support base for a longer term solution, arriving at some sort of a collective decision on identifying some of the threats, challenges, priorities that could actually gradually and eventually at least ease the process of developing consensus, which has been the biggest impediment in developing or strengthening the outer space regime.
Thank you, Raji. I'm going to bounce quickly to Daniel, just fast, because one of the things that struck me coming back to the US after 6 years in Geneva is it in US fora, governmental fora, not so much in the diplomatic world, but not at the State Department, but I work mostly with the Pentagon, right? And the defense industry. We're going to get to Mario on the industry in a minute. And you mentioned the word COPUS. They don't know what you're talking about. They don't know that there has been governance work at the international level. They don't know that it applies to them.
Yeah, that's one of the big issues that we've discussed this as well, that COPUOS technically, or at least let's say the Outer Space Treaty, it governs everyone. It is supposed to apply to the military, to military activities, at least in non-wartime military activities. We haven't really explored what it would look like in wartime. So one of the big problems that I often see is we often talk about gaps in the law that are allowing the militaries to do whatever they want, or to essentially have a carte blanche for space activities. And I don't think that's necessarily true. I do think that one of the things we should do is start to define better how to apply the laws that do exist. So yesterday we were having a conversation about the Geneva Convention, Article 2.4 and Article 51. How do they apply to outer space? There are lots of lawyers who are sitting around having that theoretical conversation, but we're not having it with the people who are actually doing the activities and the missions. So I think that's something that we definitely need to start reaching out to more of the military folks and explaining, the same way that you would explain to Marines who are going out into a terrestrial field, tell them, look, these are your guardrails. These are the boundaries where you can and cannot operate.
Thank you, Daniel. That's a really good point about teaching or socializing, if you will, these governance issues into military operations and also into our national governmental discussions. For example, you mentioned the Geneva Conventions, and there are, the legal discussions, which some people will brush aside and say, well, you can always find a lawyer to agree with you. But But there is an agreement, there has been an agreement at one of the groups of governmental experts at the UN that the Geneva Conventions apply in space, that they do apply. That has been agreed by the General Assembly. That's all 193 countries. That is something that is applicable to every country and its military. So these are things that I think people don't know. And speaking of
But
people
how do we apply them?
yeah, well, that's another question, and that's a question that obviously needs to be fleshed out or discussed. But the fact that people don't even know that is a bigger barrier, I think, at a certain level. And that sort of brings me to Marie and the questions related to industry, because I think industry also, both at national levels and at international levels, doesn't also necessarily know what the guardrails are for their activities or for what they're allowed or not allowed to do. And also for how they make their voices heard in these governance panels, because industry will be governed either at the national level or the international level. And I would think that they would want to make their voices known and also perhaps contribute their expertise to helping diplomats and soldiers, who don't necessarily know much about Delta V, how to actually govern in a way that makes sense. So Marie, if you could chat with us a little bit about that.
Sure, and just to I think you raised two questions there. The first, do industry know what actually rules are out there, and do they know how to apply with or comply with them? And then the second part being how to engage in discussion. So I'll start with the first one. And just to mention that I used to be on the government side of things, and now I'm on the industry side of things. And I find it very interesting that for example, when it comes to national space legislation, which is supposed to reflect, the international obligations, we are currently in a process here in Norway for adopting a new national legislation. And what we discovered is that a lot of these concepts are very loose. They're very broad and open to interpretation. So even if you are trying to be a responsible company, you read up on the obligations and you try to implement best practices, there's a lot of open questions. And we see that even when they come down on a national level and are implemented through national legislation, a lot of these companies, they operate across jurisdictions. And we see that these laws, which look very similar on the first glance, are actually implemented quite differently. So I think that sometimes we sell the companies a little bit short in saying that they just don't know. But that's not because of ignorance, it's because it's simply hard to know sometimes. So I think this is also important to keep in mind, that these things that we discuss here has to be implemented in a sensible manner that is easy to understand for everyone involved. And that then brings me to the second part of your question, and how industry needs to or wants to engage. And I think we have for sure seen in the past couple of years that these, both when it comes to the safety, sustainability, and perhaps even security, although that might be a little bit more difficult because then, geostrategic interest and all that. But in short, industry wants to contribute, and we see it on a national level, we see it on a regional level, and we even see it on an international level. But the problem is that on an international level, we have to find different constellations, because as of now, there is no mechanism for us to engage in a constructive and transparent manner with the discussions at COPUOS or CD. I'm not saying necessarily that industry should be allowed free reins in, but I do think if you want industry to engage with all the things you mentioned here, the knowledge of what's happening, the expertise from doing these things, there needs to be some sort of mechanism that allows them to engage in a transparent and constructive manner.
Thank you, Marie. And that was a good segue to go back to Peter for a couple seconds to talk about the barriers, the issues that he saw within COPUOS. One of those questions was how to have industry input into the long-term sustainability guidelines. I know how the US did it because I was actually on one of the industry panels that was providing input to the State Department, but there were some issues about that in COPUOS, and that's just one of the many issues that were there. So, Peter, if you could take just a quick 5 minutes and run us through the lessons that you learned, the barriers that you saw in international governance at COPUOS. Remember that COPUOS was looking at things like space sustainability and questions of best practices for ensuring that people don't run into each other in space, that folks know what each other are doing. things that don't relate necessarily to warfare or et cetera, environmental protection, those kinds of things. So Peter, why don't you talk for 5 minutes, and then we'll flip over and open up to audience questions.
Okay, thanks, Teresa. So there are two dimensions to this, and I don't know if I'll be able to cover both of them in the 5 minutes. The first is the aspect of industry participation. The second dimension is the effective participation of delegations, particularly from emerging space nations or developing countries, and that's something I'd really like to talk about as well. Coming back to the participation of industry, so we had this thorny issue of industry engagement. And as you can imagine, that was quite varied in Corpus. Some countries coming to Corpus with extremely well-prepared positions, informed by industry views, industry participation, and indeed even industry advisors on their national delegations. Other states took a very dim view of industry participation in Corpus and almost saw that as a kind of attempt by industry to influence the agenda of a multilateral body. And so the way I dealt with this as the chairman of the LTS process was to figure out a mechanism to separate out the political decision-making forum from basically just a deliberative kind of a forum. And what we did was to establish expert groups. We established expert groups under which countries could nominate national experts, and those experts then addressed a whole bunch of topics on the agenda, which they did so following the consensus rules of Corpus, but the expert groups were deliberative fora. They were not decision-making fora. They could simply recommend candidate guidelines to the working group. The beautiful thing about that was that in principle, countries could veto candidate guidelines in which their own experts had participated. And there were a few instances of this, but by and large, that process was quite successful in the sense that the first 12 guidelines that were adopted by the LTS working group all emerged from this bottom-up discussion involving experts from governments and industry. So that was one mechanism that we used within the context of Corpus that allowed industry engagement and participation. Something else we also did was to invite industry associations, trade associations, to present their input on certain topics. So this wasn't individual companies, but associations representing the collective interests of companies. And we had a few inputs from those. And then, of course, also professional bodies, such as the International Academy of Astronautics, the IAF, because there again, many space professionals in industry are members of these professional bodies. And so through those processes, we could get inputs from industry. I think that we did probably as well as could be done under the circumstances, but this will continue to be a challenge for Corpus, is how to integrate the inputs of industry, which is rapidly accumulating, very, very considerable amounts of operational experience in space. That's the industry side, and I can come back to the national delegation side if you want to move to another point.
Can I do a quick hot pursuit on that one? As some of you know, I was involved with another process before I got into the security field where we were trying to work very closely with industry, and that was the adoption of the space protocol to the Cape Town Convention. And that whole effort was trying to put together.
I think you might want to explain what the Cape Town Convention is.
Yeah.
I don't even
know. It was it was an agreement where we were trying to set up an international framework for asset-based financing for satellites. So the same way that you take out a loan to buy a car and you use your car as collateral, the Cape Town Convention, it's usually used for planes and trains. You basically take out a loan and use the plane as collateral. And the international agreement is there because if the plane ends up in another country when somebody tries to seize it, they'll have to use the law of that particular country. So we're trying to do this with satellites. And when I first got into the effort, industry was very much being an advisor. And I'm not entirely sure how it happened, but somewhere along the way, I think somebody made the comment about, well, why are we trying to give poor countries access to their own satellites when we could just sell them the same services? I'm not entirely sure how that kind of became the sound bite that came out, but it became really contentious. Before you knew it, within the institute, at Unidois, you basically had a couple of Western countries plus industry pitted up against the developing world. And a lot of countries, particularly Germany, were taking positions like, look, this is a governmental negotiation. Industry doesn't get to dictate how this is going to shake out. Ultimately, we did manage to adopt the protocol, but it hasn't even come into force yet. And I think in large part because industry did end up at a very adversarial position with it. So I do think that it's very important when whatever discussions or conversations we're having about norms or rules, you got to go to industry very early on and make sure that the actors who are going to get impacted by this stuff are aware of it. The code of conduct also, when we were doing the EU code of conduct, I think a lot of industry also was not aware that if countries adopt voluntary measures, it's voluntary for them, but then they have to implement it as law within their own countries. So industry needed to be paying attention to the things that were being talked about, even in the code.
One more thing on the industry participation. I don't know how many of you are familiar with, but you should be familiar with the ITU, the International Telecommunication Union. And they do have a methodology for having industry involvement in the regulatory, well, they don't regulate, they license. Sorry, I don't want to get sideways with the legal terms, but in a room full of lawyers. But the fact of the matter is they do have a system for having industry input and industry members, or whatever. They're not members, but they're kind of associate members or something, to the ITU, and processes for industry involvement at the ITU. The ITU is a very important regulatory body that also sits in Geneva and which almost never gets invited to talk to the COPUS or the CD. And yet the ITU has been around for a very, very long time, longer than any of those bodies, and has, by and large, I mean, there are those who hate the ITU, and it does take a really long time, and industry complains, and governments complain, everybody complains, but by and large, it's been able to deal with the questions involved in allocating access to spectrum to countries, to companies, on a basis that has not led to conflict. There hasn't been a war over spectrum access. And so that actually is a successful model that perhaps we should think about. So I'm going to go over to the questions here, which are in the Q&A. I guess I might have said that, put them in the chat. For those of you listening, please put them in the Q&A. So there's a Q&A button down here, off to your right at the bottom of your screen. And you can ask your questions there. I can't promise you that I will get to all of them, but I will try as you know, as much as possible to do that. So I want to talk a little bit about the question that we raised at the top of the hour with Andre. There's several questions on this, several of them from Victoria Sampson from Secure World Foundation. Hi, Victoria. And this involves the questions of the silos between civil and security space that exist at the national level and that also exist at the international level. They exist at the regional level. In fact, there is a problem always ongoing between, say, NATO and the EU, even. As you know, the EU is a civil and military organization, and NATO is a military organization involving the same countries. And they don't necessarily talk on space policy and space activities. So is there a need for those silos, or should the UN rethink those silos? And can we have discussions about security issues in COPUOS, traditionally with the mandate of quote unquote peaceful uses of outer space, although, all you lawyers know there is a large debate over what the word peaceful actually means. But can we bring security issues even sideways into COPUOS without COPUOS, breaking down and losing its effectiveness? Who wants to raise their hand? I have to get out. This is awkward because I can't see everybody because of the question panel. So who wants to raise their hand and start out on that? Andre, you want to go? Yeah.
Sorry. Yeah. Well, I actually paid Victoria for that question, right? Yeah. Actually, she gets paid by the question. So I think there are three questions by her already. Now, I think this is a very interesting issue. And the thing is, we have to travel back to the 1950s when COPUOS was established. And the resolution that established COPUOS says, let me quote, I got it here. One of the preambular paragraphs says, that the General Assembly, desiring to avoid the extension of present national rivalries into this new field, and recognizing the great importance of international cooperation in the exploration and exploitation of outer space for peaceful purposes, blah, blah, blah. Well, it seems to me that, the message is very clear. When we use space, we should not simply repeat the same mistakes we are making on Earth. And that was back in 1959. We have to make new ones. I'm not saying that this is easy. I mean, when we bring other issues into COPUOS, such as security, you have the risk of bogging down the discussions, as Victoria said. But honestly, we don't need to bring security issues to bog down COPUOS. There are many more, far more efficient ways to do that. If I want to basically stall the discussions there. Now, the question is, to me, we have to decide: do we want to do that? Do we recognize? Do we agree that this is a discussion worth having, and it is a discussion worth having with all players? Of course, addressing their different levels and formats and ways of involvement, because COPUOS is a member state, a government-based body. But as Mary just reminded us, I mean, we need to have the input of industry, because I don't think Elon Musk will wait for us to decide what we do in space, what we can do in space. And I'm using him as an example.
No, there's actually a question in the group that seems to be asking that question.
Yeah. Okay, but the thing is, we need to address those problems. I mean, the fact, if people tell me, oh, we shouldn't bring this to COPUOS because it'll make things complicated, is this the right question that we should be asking, or shouldn't we be asking, okay, how can we discuss these important issues without, running the risk of bogging down COPUOS? Because not discussing these issues is well, that's not an option. You cannot simply say, okay, COPUOS will not talk about security at all. No aspects of security, because we should. Oh, okay, and now the problem is solved. Great. Okay, no, it won't happen. It will actually get far more serious. And the same thing will happen, at the CD. You go there and say, no, we shouldn't be talking about this because that's Vienna or that's New York. Well, problems, those issues, those problems, those questions, those challenges, and we are talking about a very dynamic sector, probably the most dynamic sector today in terms of technology, and of course all the concerns this technology brings in its wake. Can we afford to be really, in a sense, well, can we afford to address those issues from a straitjacket, from a perspective that was, conceived back in the 50s, when basically you were talking about two space powers, to be at that time, because they were just really starting their big programs, and in a reality where you have, for example, the private sector, where you have academia, where you have a number of other interests, where you have huge plans. I don't think that is something we can really do. So the question is not whether we can do it, but how we do it. And honestly, just to address the question of the general, I didn't quite pick up who the person was. But if I were a president, prime minister, or chairman, or whatever, and a general came to me and told me something like that, you know, and we need to address and deal with space only from a national security perspective and war, war-like approach, I would say, well, sir, if you want to keep your job, you have to do better than that, because we can't afford a conflict in space. Bring me a different solution, right? Address national securities, but bring me a different solution.
Thank you. Peter, you have your hand up. You've had your hand up. And this is on the issue of COPUS, but also on the question of civil military dichotomies in the international community and even in the national governance. And then I want to move along. Go ahead, Peter.
Yeah, so I totally agree with everything Andre has said. And just to give you a practical illustration of this, in COPUS for quite a number of years, it was impossible to have a discussion around things like on-orbit servicing or technologies for active debris removal, because there were concerns around the dual use aspects of those technologies. And so people said, no, we don't need to talk about ADR here in COPUS. That's something that belongs over in Geneva, you know, in the Conference on Disarmament. And so those discussions were not had. And we had these 21 guidelines that don't address this issue. Interestingly, though, during the process of negotiating the guidelines, there were in fact some candidate guidelines on this issue, and I fully expect that there will be some willingness to discuss this topic, because as we all know, industry isn't waiting for the UN to decide whether this topic belongs in Geneva or in Vienna. They're going ahead and doing this stuff anyway. And so I think it's very, very important that there are these two bodies, the CD, you know, the disarmament discussions that happen under the first committee, and the peaceful uses that happen under the fourth committee. I think that separation of mandates is useful because it allows us to avoid a situation where some contentious issues may block everything. And so I think respecting the mandates of the two bodies is important, but there should be greater interaction between them. And there are also the boundary between them isn't crystal clear. It's actually fairly fuzzy. And there are, in my view, there's one way that one can look at these topics which could help to decide where an issue belongs, and perhaps even to have some discussion between the two. And that is that what I call the 3 S's. It's safety, security, and sustainability. And you can think of space safety and space security and space sustainability as being key concerns of those two fora. But one thing that is common, a common concern to all users of space, is space safety. And so that provides a lens through which you can look at issues in a non-political area that should be of common interest to everyone. So I think the silos that you mentioned, Teresa, between the first and fourth committee bodies, there has been some progress in addressing those. As you know, there have been some joint first and fourth committee meetings. I think that's a useful step in the right direction. And I hope that we'll see more engagement between those two committees and their supporting bodies, you know, UNODA and UN-USA, which I know there is already a dialogue that is ongoing. And I think it's a good step.
Once again, followed by the mute button. You might want to explain when you say what UNODA or UN-USA are, because there is a question in here that says, is COPUS a government body or a body that represents the interest of the international community? The governance need to ensure the voice of all actors in their jurisdiction. I think maybe we need to explain to the audience what COPUS can and cannot do. What is UN-USA? The question is, what role can UN-USA play? But I'm not sure everybody watching this would know what that acronym means and what UNODA is. Just briefly, Peter, if you want to just explain those 3 things and the difference between them.
Right. So UN COPUS is a standing committee of the United Nations, which was founded in the very early days of the space age with I think it was 24 or 26 members, I'm not exactly sure, but the membership now is somewhere around 95 and comprises basically all the spacefaring nations and a very large number of space reliant nations. The committee has produced over the years, it has produced a body of international law, which consists of 5 treaties, but also a large number of General Assembly resolutions, guidelines, principles, etc., which are not legally binding, but many states consider them politically binding and have in fact domesticated the provisions of these voluntary guidelines, principles, etc., into their national space law. And so, for example, there are UN space debris mitigation guidelines that were adopted by COPUOS, which a significant number of countries have incorporated into their national space legislation. The most recent development in COPUOS was the adoption of a set of 21 guidelines for space sustainability, which address measures that states can implement in their policy, regulatory, scientific, and technical capacities to enhance the sustainability of outer space activities for the benefit of all nations now and in the future. These again are non-binding, but non-binding does not mean non-legal in the sense that states can choose to implement certain provisions from these voluntary guidelines into their national legislation and therefore make it binding on their citizens and on companies within their jurisdictions. In terms of the acronyms UN-USA and UN-ODA, UN-USA stands for the UN Office for Outer Space Affairs, which is based in Vienna, and it provides the Secretariat for COPUOS, for the committee, but it also provides a large number of supporting services to the member states, particularly in the areas of building up their capacity to harness space for peaceful uses, so applications of space technology, development of national space law, and so on. And I've just scratched the top of the iceberg there. UN-ODA stands for the UN Office for Disarmament Affairs, which deals with the disarmament aspects of, under which the space security issues are discussed. It deals more broadly than just with space issues.
Okay, so I'm going to throw in just a couple other explanatory terms here. And one is just to note that the first committee at the UN is the committee that discusses and debates and makes resolutions on issues related to international security, and space security falls under that committee, and that's the UN ODA's purview, if you will, management purview. The fourth committee is the Science Committee, essentially, and that Commerce Committee of the UN, and that committee deals with the quote-unquote peaceful uses of outer space and has its linkages, if you will, to COPUOS in Vienna. So just so you can be confused, at the end there will be a test, and I will expect all of you to be able to draw an org chart. The other thing that I wanted to mention for our audience is something that often gets confused in conversation, and that is the difference between norms and laws, and norms and rules, and how you make differentiation between these things. Norms, they're norms of behavior. It's a term of art in diplomacy and international affairs. And norms can be set in many ways, not just by countries saying, we agree to do this, or we agree not to do this. They can actually be set by what people do and how they do them. And that is something that there's another term for called soft law. I don't want to get into the, the deep, dark issues of soft law because it's really, really hairy, but they're essentially the same thing. A norm is how people behave and how people agree to behave. You can have a norm in your small community. The norm is that you pick up your garbage in front of your own house. You don't throw garbage into your own front yard. That can also be a rule that's enforced, a regulation that's enforced by your local community or your housing association, for example. It can also be a law at the state level, which means that if you throw garbage in your front yard, in Switzerland, you will get a fine. and those rules and laws also exist at the international level. There are norms of behavior at the international level. There are rules, if you will, and there are laws. The Geneva Conventions are a law. They are not voluntary. So just to make sure that people know what we're talking about here, in the area of space governance, you can choose to use any of those tools. And some tools, like norms at the international level, get turned into laws at the national level, what Peter was talking about, where you reach a non-binding political agreement in COPUS, and yet you put that into your regulations as a country in Norway and its upcoming law, or in France where they have, or in the United States where they have. So I just wanted to make that explanation for those who are listening to this and are not as up to speed as all of us on this panel on those things. So there is a question about the UK resolution that's in front of the UN right now. And it says, any comments on the current UK effort at the UN to get a binding space resolution? I wasn't sure this was binding. I'm a little confused. Raji, do you want to address that for me?
Yeah, sure. Yeah, I think I like that UK proposal in particular because of a couple of different things. First and foremost, I think it doesn't prescribe a particular format, and it does seem like a bottom-up approach. It does ask the state representatives to come up with their priorities in terms of identifying the challenges and threats and so on and so forth. So it does give all the member states a certain amount of voice to say as to, from their perspective, what are those things that they would like to see being addressed in a future instrument. And second, it doesn't say that it is going to be a code, or it's going to be a norms of responsible behavior, or is it going to be a binding measure. It is up to the states to come to some understanding of how they would like to take it forward and so on and so forth. So in a sense, it does give all the parties a lot of say, a lot of free will, so a lot of freedom to kind of choose the kind of finally what kind of measure they would like to see and so on and so forth. So it is a good measure, at least for those very reasons. But I think a second important aspect is that it does provide an alternative to PPWT. PPWT, the prevention of the placement of weapons in outer space, which is a Russia-China proposed draft treaty, which was initially proposed in 2008, and a revised text was provided in 2014 at the Conference on Disarmament in Geneva. It has had some limited support, but a whole lot of countries, including those countries like India, for instance, which have supported, which have argued or campaigned for legally binding measures, have not really come out supporting PPWT because of a few inherent problems there. So I think there are certain issues. So this at least certainly provides us an alternative to think about, because I think that for the longest time, that has been the problem. Okay, you don't like PPWT. What next? What else? What alternative do you have? So here is an alternative proposal for countries to look at, for governments to look at, and then maybe make your own case as to what are those problems and challenges that look as priorities to you. I think it's a pretty good proposal, and it has had a reasonably good support so far. So we need to see how that goes forward.
Just to make clear, the UK proposal is for countries to come to the UN and to talk about the threats they see. This is primarily looking at conflict in space and military issues in space, rather than threats per se from space debris, correct?
Security proposal, absolutely.
Yeah. Okay. Daniel, I want to bring something else into this, because there are several questions about NASA's Artemis Accords, and, sort of as a bookend to the UK proposal, the Artemis Accords, which NASA has put forward, and a number of countries have signed on. There's, but other countries see this as a, kind of as the US trying to, bully everybody else into doing what it wants. And I say that as a citizen, proud citizen of the US, but there's often that perception in international bodies. And so there are other countries, China, Russia, some other countries that are looking askance at the Artemis Accord. So I kind of want to bring those in and talk about how those are being perceived, how they're, there is something of a rationale for countries looking a little bit askance, because the United States has essentially said, at least over the past several years, we're just going to get together like-minded countries, and then we're going to put forward what we want, and people can come and agree or not agree. And that's kind of been the process. And that's a different process than the UK has taken in the UN. And so I kind of want to talk about what the reactions to that are. We have very little time. In fact, we're probably at time. Daniel, you get to answer this question. Go.
Well, actually, I wanted to ask another question, but since I know we've run out of time, this is supposed to be our limit. So speakers, since I am the organizer, if somebody needs to drop off, please feel free. I'd like to keep this going for another 15 minutes. And also, I have a question from Marie that I want to ask before this is over, because I've had problems with breaking down some silos with industry.
Okay.
So let's keep going.
I'm good with that, Daniel. I can stay.
Okay. I'll kind of answer the UK, the Artemis Accord question real quick. Let me have a quick glance at it. And then maybe Andre might have some interesting things to say about this, but I'm still kind of confused about what the legal status of the Artemis Accords are, because I mean, if it's space agencies signing agreements between one another, like what does that implicate for foreign policy and for the legal situation? But where I do think it's fascinating is that it's such a neat approach for using science and space exploration to influence activities in other areas. So maybe this is something that we should be more open to. You know, the Artemis Accords have, for example, like one of the provisions in there is that all activities done for the Artemis Accords are done for peaceful purposes. Well, whose definition of peaceful purposes are we talking about? There are a lot of people who are going to have input into what that means. And maybe this is a good way to kickstart that conversation.
Okay. Related to that, I guess I'm going to go to Andre on that issue, but I want him to bring in this other question that we were talking about. The UK resolution leads back into that. There's a question about the fact of the matter is that great power military competition in space has increased dramatically in the last several years, you could say decade, but I would say even in the last 5 years, it's increased dramatically. And this is just it's a fact of life. And that is also an obstacle to governance because of the distrust amongst the great powers in this issue area. And they are the dominant space players. So there is a question of how do you deal with preventing conflict in space when essentially in that great power competition, emerging spacefaring nations really may not have much of a say. And international governance bodies may not have much of a say, since this is about great power competition. And in the end, the UN is only made up of the powers that are in the UN, and and you know, the Security Council can veto things. So maybe we can just talk a little bit about that macro issue, starting with Andre for a couple.
Oh, well, that's a difficult question to answer, because honestly, one of the major superpowers would come and say, well, I'm going to do that, stop me. We can't, right? The UN cannot do that. I mean, so we shouldn't even be talking about that. What we need really is commitment and engagement. So one thing that I've always said that is an alternative to conflict is to develop projects that involve a larger number, a broader base of actors from different sides of the political spectrum. And then I want to use the Artemis as an example. Brazil is a party to the agreement, and I think that's a great thing, because it does help. Something like Artemis does help attract greater interest and greater involvement from society at large, I would say. But it does have a very positive effect. And I've heard from some of the countries that perhaps we would assume would be opposed to the Artemis, that they actually like the initiative, So sometimes, of course, that's off the record, so I cannot even name what countries actually made that comment. But it is interesting to observe that not everything we see on public display, like the discussions at Copus, truly reflects what happens behind the scenes. And there's a lot of bilateral and well, not only bilateral, but involving, let's say, larger numbers of actors involved, where they do agree. They perhaps cannot publicly agree because then there are these, national security concerns and whatever. But I think there is a growing realization that we have to find shared approaches. The Artemis, I think, is a positive thing because of the language that was chosen. And when we compare the way Artemis was put forward with the EU Code of Conduct that Daniel mentioned, well, we see a very different result. Because when the Code of Conduct was presented, I would say that many countries were very, very defensive. My experience with Artemis has not been exactly the same. Okay, there may be some concern or some suspicion, but definitely I have not seen a defensive approach where countries say, no, this is off, this is absolutely, out. We are not going to talk about it, non-starter. No, and with the Code of Conduct, you did have that. So the thing is, when you look at things such as Artemis or any other approaches that we could put on the table, what we would need to do is really to get those different players across the political spectrum and even industry, perhaps as consultants. Then there are, I think, many different alternatives, and ask them, okay, look at this and tell me what your concerns are. How can we make this acceptable so this is good for everyone and we can work together? Because if everyone has a shared interest or joint stakes in a specific project or approach or agreement or whatever, then you would be reducing the encouragement, or rather you would be raising the price that would need to be paid if people decided to engage in conflict. And it would affect a larger number of actors. So basically, it would be in everyone's interest to keep things working, under, let's say, a peaceful umbrella, even if you're dealing with national security.
Great. And that I'm going to go back to you, Daniel. But I just wanted to say, I think that is one, when we were trying to talk about solutions to these things, I think that's really important to talk about whether some of these solutions can be project by project based or issue by issue, if you will. This is a classic thing in international diplomacy. You try to find something of mutual interest that people can work on as a kind of low hanging fruit. In a way, one would have thought that the long-term sustainability guidelines would have been that. The fact that it took so long to get there means that maybe they weren't such it wasn't such low hanging fruit after all, but they did get there. And there has been, I think, since then, an acceptance of the fact that countries need to work together on issues like debris, and even on issues like or what you were talking about, maneuvers on orbit and refueling and some of these repair issues, and to bring industry into those discussions, as is happening in the United States, for example, with the what's it called? I blanked on the name. Daniel will know. The group that's together looking at orbital maneuver type stuff.
Oh, confers.
Confers. I always want to say confers, and then I get in my head conifer, and then things get messed up. So confers, and so with that project, which is an industry government public-private partnership, working to try to figure out some of these issues around how you maneuver in space safely. Daniel, you wanted to jump on that question. You also wanted to.
So it wasn't even that question. I wanted to throw it over to Marie because.
So you go.
So here's the big dilemma that we had recently, and it ties in with what Andre was saying. A couple of years ago, Victoria and Brian and I organized a informal consultation with industry about space security issues. So we got all these folks from the Washington area around IAC into the room, and Brian gave this great presentation about all the different types of counter space capabilities that are coming out. And we said, what do you think? What are you worried about as industry? Like, does this present a problem for you? And they were like, nah, not really. Mostly what we're worried about is space traffic management. So I guess my question to you is, especially in light of this UK resolution that just came out that is focused on space security, how do we get industry more involved, and how do we kind of make a safe area for them to be able to talk and not feel like, oh my God, I'm going to say something that's going to piss off the Ministry of Foreign Affairs or the Department of Defense. How do we get that interaction going on the security side of things?
Yeah, no, that's a great question, and I don't have an easy answer for you at all. I think you're onto something there when you say informal could be a good way to go, and also, I mean, it comes back to also perhaps involving them more in the process, because if your daily bread and butter is to look at business cases for this or that. Security is something that's it's relevant for you, but that's something the government's supposed to handle. But if you now realize, okay, we can actually benefit from having also industry involved in security questions, there has to be a little bit of a maturization process. Yeah, is that a word? Yeah, I think so. You have to mature industry into having an opinion on this, giving them a chance to sit down with the rest of their company and think, okay, does this matter for us? And we're asked here now to actually give an input. How can we do that in a way where we perhaps also need to coordinate a little bit with our government ahead of time? But we can all agree, and perhaps also in the discussion they then will have with their government, they can actually mature the position of the government as well in saying, look, we do actually worry about debris stemming from such and such, or operations coming too close to our satellites. This is something we observe on our industry side, that capabilities are emerging. But I think it's a process on either side that, yes, they need to be involved, but then they also need to have the time to actually develop an opinion.
Let me just can I just come in for 30 seconds? So there's been a lot of industry question, and how do we get a bigger participation? And I think that's very important. And I would say that I think you need to bring them onto the table, whether it is in Vienna, Geneva, and so on and so forth. But Geneva, you have seen a lot of resistance from the state governments about how and whether these are arms control, space security issues are completely state-driven issues for them to deal with, and therefore the strong resistance. But also, I think some of the resistance is coming from the fact that industry participation, private sector participation, these are primarily dominated by the Western countries. So outside of the West, I think it is still most of the space programs are run by states. So therefore, when private sector wants to take a bigger role, bigger voice out there, then there is a skepticism among the non-Western countries that it is going to be the Western narrative that's going to be dominant in the rule-making exercise, whether you're developing rules of the road, standards, guidelines, all of that. So that's where that skepticism is coming if we were to kind of look at the non-Western perspective. So I think that's very important to keep in mind. So until and unless you have a sizable sort of industry presence in non-Western countries in Asia and so on and so forth, I think it's going to be very difficult. That resistance will continue to be a major factor to involve private sector, giving the industry a bigger voice in governance debates.
Raji, that is a really good point, and one that I don't think can be stressed enough. That first of all, the whole idea of who is industry and how and what's private sector, it differs around the world, and there are different definitions. Secondly, there are historical issues, and there are historical issues of colonization. There are issues of, dare I mention the East India Tea Company, and that have to be realized, that these are very important historical questions. There is also a strain in industry that there are a number of industrial leaders who seem to believe that rules don't apply to them at all, whether they're Western rules or international rules or whatever. That as long as they have the money, they're going to be able to do whatever they want in space, and that doesn't help matters because it raises those issues in non-Western countries. And I think that's really, really a super important thing that we need to think about. Peter had his hand up first. I'm going to go to Peter, and then I'm going to go to Mari, and then we really are going to have to wrap. Okay, Peter.
Great. Thank you. Yeah, I just wanted to weigh in briefly on this question of industry engagement. So I completely agree with everything that's been said before. Just one point that I wanted to add is, I think that industry will increasingly find its voice in calling out what it sees as irresponsible behaviors. As you know, as industry actors become more engaged in space, as they have more investment, more assets in space, they're going to be pretty annoyed if their operations get disrupted by irresponsible behaviors of other actors, be they industry actors or state actors. And I think that you will see a growing willingness on industry to call out what they see as irresponsible behavior. And this may in some way facilitate this engagement we were talking about earlier on. And also this sort of calling out could be, I think, facilitated by the growing availability of commercial and open source space situational awareness data. So more people can see what's happening out in space, who's doing what. And so I think that we will see a natural tendency for industry to become more involved in these kinds of discussions.
And that actually sets us up to think about industry as a possible vector for cooperation and a possible way that you can bridge some of these issues amongst governments by saying we actually need to have agreements on things like debris creation, et cetera, in order to foster economic benefits for our peoples on Earth through how industry operates. Mari, I'm going to give you the last word on this, and then we're going to wrap ourselves.
Yeah, thank you. No, I just want to say I completely agree with what the previous statements were here, and also just to come back to the concern of industry, you know, being represented more heavily in some countries than other, and also some industry organizations being stronger than others. I mean, I represent an organization in a very small country, so I certainly understand that concern. But I think a lot has been done to involve industry, both through projects. The UNUSA has done a lot of good things there, and also on an ad hoc basis, as Peter mentioned. But I think in order to address those concerns of transparency and fairness, it is very clear to have, it's important to have a very structured way and a clear way for industry to participate, so that it becomes obvious how you can do it, what limitations you are, and how to ensure somewhat fair representation between those who speak or participate. And I think a lot of that can be addressed. I think the ITU has done a lot of interesting things there that perhaps could be replicated. I'm not sure the conversation at COPUS is as mature and technical as it is at ITU, but I think there are ways to overcome these things, but they also need to be addressed, that's for sure.
Okay, before we go, I'm going to give all of our panelists a challenge to think about and maybe to speak about in future. And it was embedded in one of the questions, and that is, how do we actually educate our own governance systems in our own nations about international governance? And how do we try to overcome the barriers internally in our national government bodies between different stovepipes internally in our national governments, which exist in all of them, between the civil and security sides, between industry and the regulatory sides in some countries with parliaments, between parliament and the administrations, whatever. But I think the big question of education about what has already been done at the international level is a really big question for all of us who are communicators by nature, I think, to think about, and how we might overcome those barriers and figure out how to encourage a more informed debate amongst all the stakeholders. So with that challenge, I'm going to shut up and turn it over to Daniel and to log us all off and say goodbyes. Thank you, everyone.
That's it. Thank you so much for everyone for participating. Thank you for all the attendees. We'll be posting the recording of this on our website pretty soon. So thanks again, and tune in next time, I suppose.
Bye, everyone.
Stay safe, everyone. Bye.
Well, it was a pleasure. Really enjoyed it. It was great to see you, and thank you for the questions.